Hey, in this video I'll be talking about my worst books and DNFs of 2025. These books are in no particular order and we'll start with the DNFs and finish with the worst books of the year. So let's get straight into it. One of the books I DNF'd was The Couple Next Door by Shari Lepena. This is a domestic thriller, and I had bought this book long before curating my taste in books, which is partly the reason why I wasn't enjoying it, I think. I DNF'd this book very early on, at page 36 to be exact, and it was simply because I couldn't get past the writing. There was a robotic quality to it that I couldn't enjoy, and for that reason alone, the book then became of no interest to me. It has since made me wonder if I'm interested in domestic thrillers or not, but this I'm not entirely sure about yet. The next book I DNF'd was White Nights by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This book is 90 pages long and I DNF'd it on page 28. For some reason, I just couldn't take the ramblings anymore. I started to read this book based on other people singing its praises and have regretted it since. To sum this book up in a couple of sentences, a self-proclaimed loser is down bad when he spots a sad, dainty maiden in distress and professes his love for her all within a span of 2 minutes. Now granted, the very nature of a DNF means I haven't read the entire book to find out if that's all there is, but the first 28 pages were enough for me. The next book I DNF'd was First Time Caller by B.K. Borison. I DNF'd this book at page 267 out of its almost 450 pages, which is my first gripe about this book. It is way too long, and for how long it was boring and bland and uninspired, despite it being marketed as inspired by Sleepless in Seattle. For how the characters were described as seemingly colourful, ultimately they were dull and hollow. I've also considered the notion that romance within the romance genre may not be for me. I enjoy romance in other genres, but the romance in the romance genre seems to be lacking for me, which makes me think that this may be good for someone who definitely enjoys that genre more. The next book I DNF'd was Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I read a review that said the author was inspired by James Joyce, who had a stream of consciousness style of writing, and it is quite apparent Rooney attempted to replicate it with Peter's point of view. It was incredibly jarring to read a lot and nothing at the same time, and I found it so hard to focus. I skipped to Ivan's part just to see if it was written the same way or not, and noticed it was written way better. Had the book been written the way Ivan's part was written all throughout, I could have seen myself finishing the book and be intrigued by the writing style as opposed to put off by it. I read another book with a stream of consciousness style of writing, which happens to be in my worst books list, and has made me realize that I don't like that style of writing, and will definitely attempt to avoid it in the future. The next book I DNF'd was Water Moon by Samantha Soto Yambao. This book read way too juvenile for me, and if it's categorized as YA, which I don't think it is, but if it is, then that's not the reason why the writing seemed juvenile. Because YA books can still have excellent writing in it, this just was not it. The relationship was also way too insta-love. This book is described as fans of Studio Ghibli, and I definitely disagree to the point where I am now wary of books being compared to Studio Ghibli. The next book I DNF'd was A Song to Drown Rivers by Anne Liang. This book is described as inspired by the legend of Xixi, one of the famous four beauties of ancient China. It is an epic historical fantasy about womanhood, war, sacrifice, and love against all odds. But simply put, this book was just way too boring for me. Nothing excited me, unfortunately. There's also no fantasy elements in this supposedly fantasy book, which was disappointing. The Wikipedia page on Xixi was way more interesting. The next book I DNF'd was Six Crimson Creams by Elizabeth Lim. This book was grating. I feel like making the main character mute was a bit of a mistake because it seemed to restrain the storytelling quite a bit. Or otherwise, it was the characters and atmosphere around that mute person that was not depicted well enough. Initially, I thought the blurb meant she can speak, she just couldn't speak her brother's names. Then I thought she'd be able to speak sometime halfway or at some point, but nothing. The last book I DNF'd was Fangs for Nothing by Stephanie Holmes. The blurb alone sounded like it was going to be one of my favourite fun reads. I had such high hopes for this book. Sadly, my gripe with this book started on page 1. The first meeting between the main male character and the female character was so strange. The main female character was disgusted by the vulgarity of one stranger, but not of the main male character because she was attracted to him. The writing was a bit heavy-handed, and as the same with Watermoon, it was way too juvenile. Also, Elon Musk exists in this world. Why?
Why?
That's it for my DNFs of 2025. The next books have the unfortunate title of being my worst books of 2025, and we'll be starting with Rouge by Mona Awad. I believe at the core of this story is an exploration of the mother and daughter relationship, and I recognize the effort. However, the execution left a lot to be desired. Not one person mattered in this book. If you ever pick this up, I recommend reading the blurb and then starting from part 4. You won't miss a thing. The next book of 2025 for me was My Husband by Maud Ventura. This book basically explores one woman's obsession with her husband. It started relatively strong and kept a solid level of engagement. Then I realized this level did not waver. There were too many parentheses as well, and honestly could have reduced the book length by like 20% if they were removed. Also, too many self-imposed questions, and could have reduced the book by another 30% if removed. There is also a mechanical style to the writing as well that made it drag and falter at points. I felt like I was in the mind of a robot at times. The most engaging part of the book is the Clementine incident, and the thoughts related to the Clementine incident thereafter. And yes, I am talking about a fruit, not a person. The next book I want to mention is William by Mason Cole. The cover is amazing and the premise is intriguing, but both are miles better than the actual story. The basic premise is about a machine going rogue, and it felt like the author had the beginning and ending in mind, but didn't know how to flesh out the middle parts, and it ended up being a bit of a drag. The next book is A Magical Girl Retires by Park Si-yeon. It's such a shame because I had such high hopes for this one. Again, the writing was juvenile, and it was compared to Sailor Moon, which is quite the disservice. The book is about a girl who is chosen, along with a group of other magical girls, to fight the most uninspired villain imaginable. The only good thing about this book is the cover illustration and the illustrations in between the chapters. The next book is Marta by Kaveh Akbar. This reads like a book filled with anecdotes. One time this thing happened, and one time that thing happened, and once when I was young, etc. This book felt like a collection of essays than a story. You can tell a poet had written this. Poetry is not something I connect with very well. It usually appears to me as a jumble of words strewn together in a sentence, and then there you have it, a poem. I tend to prefer poetic writing from a novelist more than a poet, and so at times the writing of this book appears that way, a jumble of words. The structure of it as well, at times more haphazard than deliberate, poetic adjacent essays basically. The next book I want to mention is The Words That Remain by Stenio Gardal. This is a forbidden queer story, and the grammar choices and the stream of consciousness type of writing completely take away from the heart of the book, which is such a shame because I had been so looking forward to reading this one. There's also a major letdown based on the blurb, which is a bit of a spoiler, so I won't mention it, but just know, though the story may seem important, the writing and storytelling choices were a huge disappointment. The next book is I Might Be in Trouble by Daniel Eilman. This book is mislabeled as a dark comedy. It is neither dark nor comedic. Maybe at times it may be chuckle, but not enough to earn such a label. The basic premise is that the main character, David, finds his date dead in his hotel room the following morning and struggles to figure out what to do with the situation. The characterization of David is one that is so depressing, I just do not enjoy being in his head. And though he can have thought-provoking and poignant thoughts, the bulk of his personality is sad boy. His naivety was also grating. Talking about meeting the love of his life day dot on a certain dating app was eye-rolling annoying. The next book is Nothing Serious by Emily J. Smith. The basic premise is that a disillusioned tech executive goes to an obsessive spiral when her best friend and longtime crush is implicated in a woman's death. Basically, read this if you want a heavy-handed lecture on feminism. And that's all I'll say about that one. The last book I want to mention on my worst books of 2025 is The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. This book is described as a moving and genre-defying quest about a lady knight whose legend built a nation, and the cowardly historian sent back through time to make sure she plays her part, even if it breaks his heart. It was expanded from the author's short story called The 6 Deaths of a Saint. This could have been a great book because the concept was there. The imaginative craft of it is excellent, but the execution is incredibly underwhelming. I was not into the whole Una being this juggernaut and Owen being a fairy type of style of characterization. At first, it seemed like it'd make way for some comedic or goofy scenes, but then it just ended up being icky. The constant calling Owen boy by Una, the way she'd have him step on her hand to hoist him up her horse, the way she'd wrap her arms around him as they rode the horse together because she was in the back and he was in the front. Or when they sat together, they sat with Owen's back to Una's chest, cradling this itty-bitty boy. There was no development from this. They remained that way all throughout the book. I also wasn't enjoying the second person writing. Writing-wise it worked, but story-wise it didn't. Second person gives me the same jarring feeling that breaking the fourth wall does in movies, except I usually have no problems with its usage in movies. Unfortunately, in this book, I found it a cheap way to show their romance and intimacy without actually showing their romance and intimacy. It tries to sound Shakespearean, but ends up being grating. I also have a wary dislike towards second person for its often sounding like a dramatic telenovela. If I had known a bulk of this book was written in second person, I wouldn't have picked it up. And unfortunately, it remains to be one of the least enjoyable reads of the year. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching my worst books of 2025. And until next time, take care of yourself.